Thanks for hanging in this afternoon. It's hard to compete with Florence, so thank you. Just so you know, I've been to Boston, Zurich, Frankfurt, and finally Florence. I want you to know, I guess I can't touch the mic, huh? Don't touch the mic. There we go. How's that? There. Don't even look away from the mic. Don't taunt Happy Fun Mike. I really wanted to be here, and I'm going to do the very best that I can, given that I'm almost delirious with exhaustion at this point. I will say this. I know that I am not at the security conference. I'm not touching it, man. I'm not touching it. That's not me. I'm not at the security conference because the Wi-Fi login and password were the same thing in all caps, right? Okay. Yeah, I'm just trying out some new material. It's cool. I can't help it when I'm on the mic. This is what I mean, real sleep deprived. Anyway, it's great actually to be in this kind of afternoon time slot because I'm great fans of the folks that have spoken to you already today, and we have engaged a lot together to a variety of extents over the years with our work. And I was especially pleased to be invited by the conveners of this workshop to participate in the small way that I can. So I just want to acknowledge that and say thank you for that invitation. But what I wanted to do in this time that I have is to foreground another group of basically of constituents for those of you who are here and are interested in doing work that intervenes upon abusive behavior online. And that is this group of workers, the human content moderators who contend with, in fact, some of the worst material that can be found on social media. And then maybe think about collectively with you how your work might support, augment, and make life easier in some way for those individuals. As was mentioned, a book on this topic written by yours truly just came out last month in the North American market. It will be out in the UK and in Europe this month, and it will be in an English language edition. We're working on an Italian edition, I understand, and some others, so stay tuned if that's your cup of tea. Really, it is the culmination of a research agenda of almost a decade. So I've been working on this topic of human moderators working on social media since 2010. And when I got started on this topic, I had to spend a great deal of time contextualizing and explaining to people what, in fact, content moderation was of social media. And it usually started out with something like, you know, when you take a picture on your phone and you upload it to the, I don't know. Is it just a static clang? I don't know. I'm sorry. You know, when you take a picture on your phone and you upload it to Twitter or to a platform of your choice, did you know there might be people in between you and that platform? I don't really have to say that anymore, especially not to this crowd, right? But even to, you know, a sort of less aware kind of constituency, and I might take as, I don't know. We're going to just try to fix that, right? Okay, hold on. Sorry, guys. That's okay. We'll get it. How's that? We like that? All right, cool. Thank you. Even among people who aren't as probably kind of tapped into to technology as an audience like this, and I usually use as a litmus test like my parents, for example, or just other folks that I know kind of in that vein. You know, this is a concept and a practice that has actual currency now much more broadly than it used to. In part, of course, this is I mean, I don't really know what's happening. Sorry. In part, this is because of stuff like this, right? So there have been a number of, well, pick your incident, I guess. Pick your incident on any major social media platform that has spurned public relations backlash, and what has happened in the last couple of years. And again, I want to just contextualize that I'm talking about sort of the American platforms emanating from Silicon Valley, sort of like the AAA version of social media platforms. Those companies, rather than disavow their commercial content moderation workforce, has actually relied more and more upon them to sort of serve as a mechanism to apologize for many gaffes that have come down upon them. And we've seen that more and more. This, this is worth noting that it is a total sea change from where we were not only when I started my research in 2010, but even just a couple of years ago, when there was still sort of a kind of a blanket unwillingness to acknowledge this human workforce. So what I want to do for a few minutes now is just contextualize a little bit about where things were when I started on this research, looking at these human actors serving as intermediaries between users and platforms and the content that was being generated. Back in 2010, I was working on my PhD at the University of Illinois, along with the esteemed Dr. Noble, whom you heard from earlier today. And I was teaching summer school. I was in the central... in rural Iowa was not what one might have expected, which, thank you very much, which would have been, in my imagination, something to do with agriculture. But in fact, they were working in what, for all intents and purposes, was a call center environment. And what they were doing in the call center was also further a surprise to me at this point in 2010. They weren't answering phone calls for support for a washing machine that had broken down, or taking some kind of service calls of that nature. In fact, what they were doing was adjudicating social media content that had been uploaded to a variety of platforms that were in sort of maybe their kind of first big ramp up at that time, but also for other websites and other commercial properties, anything that basically had a mechanism by which people could contribute user-generated content. At this point in time, I was working on my PhD in information science. I had myself undertaken a career in tech prior to returning to the academy, so I had like a 15-year career in tech. Prior to that, and I'd been on the internet at that point for about 20 years. I got on the internet in '93 on the social internet and felt like I was that I'd missed the halcyon days and I'd missed the boat as a late adopter. Anyway, that's a joke, right? '93, late adopter. Okay, but anyway, given all of that context. here was the first time that I'd ever considered really in aggregate the nature of the problem that these commercial platforms were presented with in terms of opening themselves up to user-generated content, not just opening themselves up to it, but predicating an entire business model on it, right? And in that instant, reading about these workers and understanding what it was they were doing, even in these sort of the most basic terms at that time, it was clear to me that, in fact, contending with unwanted user-generated content had to be a massive problem for any commercial platform, period, the end. And the fact that I had never thought about that until that point, nor had I ever heard not only any of my esteemed peers talk about it, but not my world-class professors in a variety of domains who by rights, if anyone should have known, it should have been them, led me to think that there was something about this practice that was likely being obfuscated, to put it mildly. Just to test out also the fact that it seemed like computers probably just couldn't neatly handle this issue back in 2010, I took myself over to the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, NCSA, which is located on the campus of University of Illinois, and I went over to the computer vision lab that was there, and I talked to a researcher there, and it was, you know, kind of like a computer vision cube space. It was a blacked out, I mean, it kind of looked like this, except the walls were all black, everything was blacked out, everything very controlled in the space, and there was kind of like an oak table sitting in the middle of the room. And I asked him about this problem. I said, here's the situation, user-generated content, platforms need to control for it. Can they just throw computation on this issue and kind of like contend with it and weed things out? And he gestured over the table and he said, see that? And I said, yeah. And he said, right now what we're working on is reliably getting the computer to know that the table is a table. Okay, obviously that's 2010, things have really advanced, right? But that told me something about sort of the fundamental paradox of what was going on with computation versus meaning making in terms of unwanted content. Every parameter in that room was controlled. This was NCSA at the U of I, and yet they were struggling. So where did that lead us? One thing it did was it led me to investigate the company, one of the companies that was profiled in that early piece. At the time, it was called Caleris. It's had a number of name changes since that time. And you can see the tagline right up here. It's one of those things that as a social scientist and a researcher, when I saw that, I just about fell out of my chair. Outsourced to Iowa, not India. All right, yeah, we get some nods, some head shakes, right. I mean, I want to call it like sort of understated xenophobia, but I think it's actually pretty overt, actually. You know, right there, what was Caleris actually selling? Well, in fact, it was packaging up and selling a particular set of purported ideologies, demographics, values, one might say, all tied to an imaginary of who we might think would be sitting in a call center in Iowa as opposed to who would be doing that in India, and then putting a greater value on one rather than the other. However, it's also doing that on the back of the Iowa family farm, which, by the way, was a thing of the past already in 2010, that Iowa family farm. Yeah, that went the way of the dodo bird back in the 80s when Willie Nelson was throwing Farm Aid concerts in this very place to try to rescue the family farm as people were getting foreclosed upon. So why are people working in call centers in central Iowa? Because they lost their family farms in the 80s. Anyway. Where does that lead us? Well, that leads us to commercial content moderation. Why commercial content moderation? Well, because as you heard probably earlier in the day, and I can only imagine, since I was sitting in Frankfurt, Germany for absolutely no reason. There are all kinds of content moderation that go on online. And much of it has been organized on a volunteer basis. It has been organized among community members. It has been self-organized. It has been a practice born out of larger governance. But this particular situation of major Silicon Valley firms kind of creating a sub-industry of for-pay professional, quasi-professional, I guess we could call it, workers doing this work as a job is actually a new phenomenon, or a relatively new phenomenon when put up against other kinds of things that we might consider content moderation writ large. And of course, we have great examples of that kind of model today. Obviously, Kat Lowe, an expert on Reddit moderation, and I think an out Reddit mod, well known. That's one example of a community that relies on that model. But the point is that that kind of intervention has always been present online, but this organized for pay version at the behest of these major firms is something different and new. And so I needed a term to denote that. I don't know if I love this, but this is what I came up with, and we're stuck with it. So please just go with me. What do commercial content moderators do? Well, as you probably know, for most of the period of time that I've been looking at this activity, what they've primarily done, those frontline commercial content moderators who kind of are in an operations setting, maybe in a trust and safety division of a firm, or maybe working for a third party like Caleris or somewhere else in the world, they are often jacked into queues. They receive material that has perhaps been flagged by users maybe once, or maybe some other threshold has to be met before that material gets put in the queue. But at any rate, they sit on the other side of those community guidelines and of that user-generated content, and they look at this reported material, weigh the material against what is allowed on the platform, and usually to a much greater degree of specificity than users ever see in terms of community guidelines, and then determine whether or not that content is appropriate. And they do this over and over again. Of course, as I have traced this practice, scale has increased exponentially, right? So when I was first looking at this issue, the statistic for something like the amount of user-generated content on a platform like YouTube was something like 100 hours of video uploaded per minute per day, 24/7. The last kind of official published stat that I really saw is, it's now outdated, as many of you know, but the last one that I was willing to hang my hat on was about 400 to 450 hours per minute. I have no doubt that that is that has increased exponentially. That's one platform, obviously, right? So when we think about all of the platforms that are predicated on user-generated content, we multiply those, we quickly see that this issue of scale and this massive proliferation of user-generated content has really been the logic and the driving force around the coalescing and the formulation of this new work form as a quasi-professional kind of activity. Commercial content moderation work is somewhat paradoxical in the sense that for pretty much the entirety of its existence as a practice, the work itself has been invisible or mostly intangible to the average user. When does the user encounter commercial content moderation? Perhaps when that user has content deleted, or perhaps when that user reports something that they have a problem with. But beyond that, beyond those fairly limited interactions, a user could conceivably be on a platform and never really realize that these processes are going on. So in other words, the sign of being good at commercial content moderation is to typically leave no sign at all that you have intervened. I think that's important to point out because that has, there's nothing particularly natural about that, that formulation of the work. In fact, that's really just a value decision on the part of platforms. And we know that there are many other ways in which moderation activities have been undertaken historically and also in this present moment online. For those of you in the crowd who go back to days of BBSs and other kinds of earlier forms of the social internet, you might have had users on platforms who had special flags and that denoted special privileges to make decisions about content on that platform. We didn't call it a platform then, but just go with me, right? I mean, I myself had those fancy privileges on a number of BBSs too, but it meant that I was imbued with special powers to adjudicate and do so overtly. Not so with commercial content moderation. It's actually designed to be surreptitious to a certain extent, right? What does that allow? Well, in a way, it allows for the ultimate discretion of the platform to not actually have to be wholly accountable for the kinds of decisions they make. And when we go back to this issue of scale and we think about the number of decisions that are made every minute, every hour, every day by each commercial content moderator employed, you can see why there's a pretty significant aversion to wanting to be held accountable for those decisions, among many other reasons as to why platforms might want to not be held to account, right? One of the features of commercial content moderation, one of the characteristics is that workers are typically under non-disclosure agreements. I'm sure no one in this room is under an NDA of any sort in your work, right? Okay, yes, another joke, yes, right, this is the right crowd for that, right? But for many of the workers that I've talked to over the years, that was taken very seriously, right? In fact, many felt that they would be dismissed if they started to talk about the nature of their work and who they worked for and under what conditions. So one of the primary findings of my early work in this area of trying to suss out, trying to find the contours of what exactly was going on with these practices was what might seem like a fairly obvious kind of insight where we sit now in 2019, but I just want to bring everyone back to a number of years ago where the opacity just reigned supreme and trying to get a handle on what was going on with this work if you were not under an NDA and in the operations side of the house in a social media firm was very difficult. One of the first things that I learned was that rather than sort of a monolithic one-size-fits-all practice, in fact, commercial content moderation was being undertaken in more of a sort of a patchwork or kind of a piece-together circumstance, in large part to meet the needs of platforms in terms of scale, but also in terms of particular capacities that they were looking for linguistically, culturally, and other kinds of context issues, as well as to find adequate labor pools, right? So all of those things converged into a series of different kinds of labor sites in which these folks worked. And obviously some people were working on site at some of these major firms, but interestingly enough, many of them were working as contract laborers. They joked kind of a gallows humor with me. Yeah, we don't get to use the climbing wall and we don't get free sushi, ha ha ha. But oh, by the way, we also don't have health insurance, right? So those non-Americans in the house, we have a special relationship to health insurance in the United States. That makes no GD sense. That's a case in point, right? We had boutique firms that were specializing, almost like ad agencies, and providing this labor soup to nuts. Not only were they removing content in some cases, though, they were on Facebook seeding content, so tumbleweed wouldn't flow through your brand page. Nobody posted about your cookie brand lately, so somebody would get on the page and say, God, aren't Oreo cookies great? Yeah, because, you know, like, you can't believe everything that you read on the internet, and sometimes people are posting fake stuff, right? They were doing that too. We had call centers like Caleris, like the one that I mentioned in Iowa, but also worldwide. So in the Philippines, in India, in Poland, in Ireland, in Austin, Texas, other places. And we had people doing this work on Amazon Mechanical Turk and other micro-labor websites. In many cases, I found that major firms were using all of these mechanisms to meet their needs around commercial content moderation, whether it was 24/7 coverage or, again, these particular contexts that they needed coverage in. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a firm called Megatech, which was an example of one of these in-house contexts. And this was a major Silicon Valley headquartered firm that has many properties. It's a transnational corporation. It has global reach. Maybe some of you in this room work at Megatech. It's possible. One interesting thing that's happened over the years is it seems like every time I go to a firm in Silicon Valley and meet with people, they're certain that their company is Megatech. Maybe it is. I never tell them. I always let them think that because, you know, it's interesting that they all think that. I talked to a bunch of workers at Megatech, all of whom were recent college grads, four-year university graduates, and none of them had graduated with STEM degrees. They were coming out of, lesser fields like literature or ethnic studies or history or economics, kind of those useless fields that thank you. Yes, I am joking. French major right here, okay? So they were not sort of in line for the lucrative jobs in Silicon Valley, and this was during an economic downturn, right? But they had this opportunity to get this new job that was very nebulous, by the way, when they went to go get hired by a third-party firm for it. None of them had ever heard of commercial content moderation before or even knew it was a practice. They were told that they might see some gross things or have to hear some, difficult stuff to deal with, and did they think they could do that? The other thing that a lot of them were bringing to the table, in addition to their humanities and social science background, was vast amounts of student loan debt. Again, Americans. Can I get a amen on that? Thank you very much. And so perhaps they were in a bit of a bind, right, in terms of what jobs they might take. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the impact that this work had on some of these folks at Megatech and some of the things that they were reporting to me. Again, for many of them, this felt like a win. It felt like a foot in the door of the industry that was on the upswing when so many others were, again, in an economic slump. Some of them expressed to me things like, before I took this job, I was working as a barista, so this beats that, and I have student loans to pay, and so on, right? Or I hope that, this job will be a means to an end, and it will allow me to be promoted within Megatech, to move from contractor status to full-time, full badge, the right color badge, right? But there were some, as you can imagine, there were some experiences that they were having as a precondition of this work that really gave them pause about the kind of perhaps Faustian bargain that they had engaged in order to roll the dice on having a career path in tech. Max Breen was one of the people I talked to who was coming off of a 2-year stint of having done this work. And, at first he was adamant that he had very little psychological impact. He would tell me things like, I can handle this job. I knew other people who had it for a few weeks and they saw the gore and they saw the child sexual exploitation, or they saw animal abuse, or they heard hate speech rhetoric and they tapped out and they just bounced. But, I can handle it, and I've been doing this, and I don't really have any, ill effects or anything like that. Well, sure, I took him at his word, but later on, here are some of the things that he would reveal, right? I can't imagine that anyone who does this job and is able to just walk out at the end of the day and just be done. You dwell on it, whether you want to or not. As someone, again, who's been on the internet for almost 30 years, I remember some of those images that back in the day when you used to have to download and decode images, they would be like humorously mislabeled, and you download and decode it, and it was something heinous. I remember that from 25 years ago, a couple instances of that. I can't imagine being in a queue where the expectation is you're going to see that all day. His colleague, Josh Santos, he expounded on some of the things that Max had said, and he said, you really don't want to talk about it. You kind of feel like you spent 8 hours just in this hole of filth that you don't really want to bring into the rest of your life. And this was something that many of them echoed. First of all, the NDAs, they felt like that precluded them from reaching out to others around them, but there was a deeper reluctance to want to talk about the work that they were doing with others. First of all, they would say things like, I haven't been socializing as much lately because when I go out with friends, we all end up talking about work, and I don't want to tell them about the things I hear and see as a commercial content moderator. I just don't want to expose my friends to that. Max Breen, the first person that I introduced you to, he said to me, again, he reiterated many times that he had no deleterious effects from the work, and then at some point in the conversation he said, I've been drinking a lot since I've been doing this job, and I've been drinking a lot when I come home from work. And then he told me a story that really stuck with me. He said one night he was sitting on the couch with his girlfriend, whom he lived with in San Francisco, his girlfriend, and they had, about 25 other roommates, right, because San Francisco, and $48,000 a year. Gross is what he was making. But anyway, he and his girlfriend were sitting on the couch, and she kind of got close to him, got in an intimate moment, kind of getting sexual with him, and he was responding, and suddenly he said he just kind of stiff-armed her and shoved her away. And he said what had happened was an image had flashed before his eyes of something he had seen at work, and he said, I just didn't even want to tell her. I just didn't even want to tell her what I'd seen. I didn't know how to tell her, and I didn't want her to know. So, here he's kind of reliving this experience, and now his girlfriend being literally shoved away from him and closed off. So anyway, I think that's going to be about where I'm going to leave it for now. Yes? Yeah, I can... Yeah. All right. So, I'm going to just kind of skip through here a little bit. The point about some of this work that I'm trying to draw out is on the one hand, the specificity and the uniqueness of the context that has given us a logic whereby this type of work makes sense and that we need it. But on the other hand, it's not just simply, the context of user-generated content and humans are evil. There's been a whole host of other things that have gone on that have led us to this. And in part, there's been a great sea change once again in terms of economic and political contexts that have led us to a point where this kind of work makes sense, particularly in the Western context. I'm talking to a room full of people who are, I presume, engaged in work. Maybe doesn't look exactly like IBM 360 and, Mad Men or whatever. But this is, the work that you're doing is born of a time where people like Daniel Bell and others who were kind of aspirationally predicting the future, wished for a workplace where people could be delivered from the dangers of the factory floor, right? The dangers of the assembly line, the rote work, the physical demands of that kind of work into this environment. I mean, it's sterile, right? We know that the server room it's like a very sterile, controlled environment. Where it's the life of the mind, it's the analytical work. I mean, there's really no greater expression of that or crystallization of that than commercial content moderation. And yet, I don't think that that is exactly what was being foreseen back in the 60s and 70s when Bell sort of, he liked to talk about forecasted a time in which people would be doing this paradigm shifting analytical work in the technical sector and class. And, you know, one of the biggest things that he was looking for, of course, was this, which was that we were all going to have a ton of leisure time if we could get out of this, manufactured and physical workplace and environment and get into the life of the analytical mind. How many of you, by the way, check email after your workday is done? Okay, I rest my case. Thank you very much, right? I mean, this isn't my work life. I don't work in a factory, but I also don't have tons of leisure time, right? So in fact, I would argue that the workplace and the workday has encroached upon much more of our lives in this, again, Western context. And we can't lose sight of the fact that it's not like manufacturing and heavy industry and precarious, dangerous physical labor has just dissipated or disappeared. In many cases, it's just been moved out of sight and out of mind for many of the people that Bell and others were thinking about, right? We also have phenomenon of precarious work in other sectors, right? So gig work or Uberization of work, we might think about it in that context. Again, this movement of shifting work in other kinds of global contexts has been a huge part not only of again, that manufacturing sector, but also of this analytical work that we were told was going to be I guess the panacea for many. I knew a guy who used to be a coder at Amazon in the late 90s, and he told me there was no way his work would ever get outsourced because he was so steeped in expertise, and he was laid off about 6 months later and was out of work for about 2.5 years. His work actually did get outsourced, and it got outsourced to India, where there were incredibly talented and prepared programmers who did the work at a fraction of the cost, right? The Philippines is a place that does a great deal of commercial content moderation, in part because of these economic and geospatial reconfigurations that have made it attractive for Western companies to take this labor and chase it to the lowest cost. And they've done so by moving to the Philippines, where a lot of this work is going on. What this has resulted in part, this move to business process outsourcing or call center work as a major project in the Philippines, of which commercial content moderation is a major part, is uneven development. So you have places that look like this on the one hand, next door to places like this, which I call the paperless office, by the way. Paperless office, everybody. Okay. And, you know, I want to point out to you, too, that this is not just some sort of artifact of, an exoticized notion of the global South. I live in LA, and there are places where this economic unevenness can be found in that city. Sophia nodding, too, because she knows. All right. I'm going to cut it off there. We can take Q&A, and we can get more in depth. Anyway, the point of talking about this group of workers to this crowd is that I can think of few people that could benefit so acutely from tools that you're working on and developing than this group of people. Because the fact is that if you talk to anyone in industry who knows about this kind of work or who's involved operationally with it, The truth is that there is no time in the foreseeable future that humans will be out of this loop. With as much automation and computer vision that has come a long way since the table is a table anecdote, right? And other kinds of NLP tools, we know that humans will be in the loop for the foreseeable future. So the question is, as we think about users on the one end and the needs of the platforms on the other, I want us to maybe keep this group of workers in mind as not only as people who need tools and support, but who also could serve as incredible sources of information about what the realities are of user-generated content-based social media platforms in the first place. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.